Then what are we saying? There can never be a deal that what Ukraine just has to be utterly destroyed?
It doesn't have to be utterly destroyed, but it has to be rendered, let's say, a dysfunctional rump state. I think that that's what the Russians are coming to understand. They essentially have to take enough of Ukraine that the remainder does not present a serious threat to them anymore. And that would, of course, include Odessa. It would include the Black Sea coast. I think that would just make it much more difficult for Ukraine to harm Russia.
So then do you think that all this peace talk plan, 28-point plan, 19-point plan, whatever, it really is just all noise, fugazi? It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, it won't be acceptable to Russia.
Right,
because
right.
Russia, no matter what, even if we capitulate in full and just say that, okay, we're going to agree to your base demands, it's still not going to be enough.
Let's say if they did everything again, I think there's a chance that Putin might actually go for it, because I think he really does want an agreement. And a lot of people worry that, worry about him in that sense, that he really does believe in diplomacy. He does believe in negotiations. He wants to have an agreement with the West. But many people around him are telling him you just can't make an agreement with the West. These people have demonstrated that they are just not, they can't be trusted. I remember actually back when Merkel came out and said that, oh, yeah, we were never serious about that. And Hollande, the former French president, also said the same thing. I was really stunned because when they said that, that was a way of saying that, yeah, we don't honor agreements, openly talking about the fact that we don't honor agreements. So what you have done, you've not only, exposed what your role in the Minsk Accords, but you have declared that, that you and your government cannot be trusted to make an agreement in the future. I just thought that it was extraordinary that they would make that kind of statement, but they did. And the Russians heard it. So yeah,
what would you tell?
I don't think it's possible. It's not going to happen. I mean, again, this 28-point agreement, even, the one that everybody's claiming in the West was somehow written by the Russians. It wasn't. It clearly actually falls short of very important Russian demands. And so, they're going to reject it outright. So there's just not. And then if Trump would put himself behind it, you could say that it represents progress. Think, where we were back in the spring when they were talking about a ceasefire. And that's exactly, what the Europeans and the Ukrainians agreed to. And the Russians said, no, we're not doing that. We don't have just a ceasefire and then try to figure out we have to have a settlement before there's some kind of ceasefire. Now, this time Trump has moved much closer to the Russian position, but he's still not there.
Okay, so what would you tell Putin? That you don't trust the West, don't sign any agreement? I mean, how do we move forward? And then what does that mean? It just means that we just keep on killing Ukrainians until the whole thing falls apart? I
mean, yeah, that's the thing. Is like, I'm kind of sort of naive, and I want to believe in the possibility of a real peace settlement. But I think the cynical part of me, which is really the more realistic part of me, knows that it just isn't possible. And I think that's probably true of Putin as well. So it is, again, like Mearsheimer has said many times, it's going to end on the battlefield. And it will be a victory for the Russians, but it will be an ugly victory. And I think they're going to take the 4 oblasts. And when they do, they're going to make like a very last offer. Say, okay, we've taken them now. Are you going to accept this? Are you going to accept our terms? And almost certainly they're going to be rejected. And then they're going to go on, to these other oblasts like Kharkov and Sumy and Nikolaev and Odessa.
Okay, but like even if they do accept the terms, I think the problem is that Putin understands that in America, the establishment is ideologically driven to destroy Russia, and that extends to the establishment in Western Europe as well. Mm-hmm. He might feel that Trump is pragmatic transactionalist and he can kind of figure out some type of deal with him. But the problem is if you make a deal with Trump, then you're just saying that the deal lasts until Trump is while he's in power. As soon as he's out of office, then it's like, okay, we'll prepare for war with Russia. It started in 2029. And I think people are talking that way. Just say, we just got to survive with the Trump presidency, and then we can get somebody back in power that's ready for war with Russia. And so we just got to hold on for another 3 years. So sorry, Ukraine. I know you're running out of people, but hang in there another 3 years, and then we'll have this grand war that we apparently are dying to have.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, that's part of it is that, you do things like you have the UN Security Council approve it, and that's supposed to make it kind of solid and makes it a part of international law. But clearly that didn't work in the case of Minsk. So what can you do? If the next administration wants to undo it, they'll find a way. There's always some ambiguity, and they'll just declare that Russia's in violation of it. That's what they'll do. And then they'll just go ahead and tear it up, like the way they've done with the various arms limitation treaties. I think that's right. I think the Russians would be very foolish. There's part of me, because the killing is so awful, that if we could stop this war now, that would be great. And I think, again, the Russians have shown flexibility on that. There was the idea of a temporary ceasefire, at least in the case of Zaporozhye and Kherson, right? But it's clear that that this is only going to be temporary. It's not going to actually end the war, and that the root causes, will not be addressed. The demands based on root causes will not be met, and the war will be fought another day. It will continue. It won't. So, the only thing they can do is just to keep on going until they get to a point where I think they feel that they've made Ukraine, they've so weakened Ukraine that Ukraine is not going to present a threat to it anymore, the kind of existential threat that it presented before. I think that Black Sea coast is very important. One of the reasons this war started is that NATO was obviously preparing to build naval bases on the Black Sea coast, the part that belongs to or is under the control of the Ukrainians. And I'm sure they'll find some way, even if you put it in the agreement, they'll find a way to try to do that again. That's something they clearly have their eyes on. And that, again, that's just one example, but that would be an existential threat to Russia. So I think, just looking at the map, that they just have to take that Black Sea coast. In other words, they have to go all the way to Odessa.
To Transnistria.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just from the Russian perspective, every major agreement over the last 30 minutes, the last 30 years has been viewed, has it been a deception or a stalling tactic or just a straight up ruse? So, and if you really want to we talk about the root causes, and Russia's always talking about the root causes, but really the real root cause here is what I just mentioned, saying that the establishment is ideologically driven to destroy Russia. And it's been that way for the past 30 years. So as long as that establishment ideology is still there, this is always will be a threat to Russia. So the reality is that establishment has to collapse. It has to fall. But I mean, when we say that, does that mean just like the whole Western hegemonic system has to fall? And that's really the part of the big battle that we're talking about, multipolarity versus U.S. hegemony. But really, that's the core root.
No, you're right. Exactly. Because again, it's this unwillingness to honor treaties, this unwillingness to perform diplomacy in good faith is just a symptom of American-led Western hegemony, of the supremacist kind of thinking that came out of the unipolar moment. They began to see that. Well, in the case of Russia, I think there's two sides to it. It is this first, the sense that we won this ideological war. So it's just that our ideology, the end of history, Fukuyama, our ideology, the Western ideology is the end of history. It is the one ideology, and we're not going to really entertain any other possibilities. Anything that opposes that is just opposing history itself, essentially. And And then, Russia was so weak at that time in the 90s that they got in the habit of just ignoring them. And those two things go together. Again, this supremacist thinking is really based on a perception of weakness on the part of Russia. They have to accept and they still, incredibly, in spite of all that, Trump is actually like the exception. Trump and Vance, the people that put forward this 28-point plan, they're starting to, hey, well, actually, we do have to take Russian demands into account, because they, in fact, are winning. But the Europeans refuse to talk like that. They're still very much in that old mindset. And all the critics of the Trump administration still talk that way. It is this supremacist thinking that assumes that Russia is weak no matter what evidence is presented, and just assumes that we have like a moral obligation to impose our way. So when you have that kind of thinking, you're not capable of engaging in diplomacy. That thinking has to go before, Russia can have a deal. And there's just no sign that it's going to go anytime soon.
Right. The problem with the ideological thinking in the establishment is that the establishment is a permanent bureaucracy. There's nothing democratic about this. No Europeans or Americans vote for this type of foreign policy, for the expansion of NATO. Nobody here in Appalachia is like, oh man, I just can't wait till Ukraine becomes part of a NATO and then I'll be safe from Putin. That's not. It's just insane. The idea that this is somehow in America's interest is absurd. But how do we change it? Because like I said, it is a permanent bureaucracy. It's not something that we get a vote on. Every year, we have, every 4 years we have our big election and nothing changes. Nothing changes. I know.
Yeah. So I'm very pessimistic about it. I don't see in the foreseeable future, I don't see any chance of this changing.
But it has to. It has to change.
Yeah, well, you're
or
right.
else this conflict continues, right?
Well, again, it was born out of historical series of events. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. That's really what it comes in. And then the birth of the unipolar moment, and then the utter weakness of Russia during the 90s and up through the early 2000s. I think it was born of that, and they just haven't. They're still living in that past, and the only way that I can see to bring it to an end is actually for Russia to win in a way that is just cannot be denied by the West. Again, that to utterly, destroy the Ukrainian army and all those NATO weapons. I don't know exactly what form it would have to take, but there would just have to be some sort of tremendous demonstration of Russian strength, and a strength that could not be denied. And then, that might be a moment of change. You can say that it happened in the case of Trump. It seems like he sort of finally realized that, wait a second, the Russians are winning. Kellogg has been lying to me. And man, I don't want to have a Biden Kabul moment here. We got to get out of this quick because this is going to be bad. That's at least the way he's thinking right now, but we'll see. He may flip again. But in general, the establishment is not with him, and not in the U.S. and certainly not in Europe. And they're still operating according to the old paradigm.
Right. Well, let's say, which is probably likely going to happen, is that Russia is just going to deliver just an undeniable victory in Ukraine, and it's over. But the Europeans, they're still, at least the elite, and not the European people, there's still this ideological fervor, this anti-Russian fervor that is baked into the establishment. So they'll just lick their wounds, but they'll do what they can to antagonize Russia further. One thing that actually I was just thinking about, because you mentioned in our last conversation just about the Baltic states, like Latvia and Estonia, they actually have fairly large Russian-speaking populations, but they are treated as second-class citizens now. And when I was just thinking, that's kind of almost like the beginning of Ukraine, where we had the Russian speakers in Ukraine started becoming second-class citizens. You're not allowed to speak Russian anymore, banned from the schools, and they started bombing the Donbass. What if they do the same thing now here in Latvia and Estonia, that they just say, okay, we got to persecute these Russians here more and more, until the point where Russia's like, well, we got to protect the Russian people there. It's just like a potential, I'm just thinking like, okay, you didn't succeed in Ukraine, they'll try somewhere else. They'll keep
Yeah.
going,
Yeah.
and
Well,
it's just like,
right. There are, um, yeah, there is that risk. Again, the Russians, they understand what's been going on in the Baltic states, and they are not happy about it, but they've never implied that it was something that would, lead to war. Uh, like in the case of Ukraine, they have made it clear to the West, they started making it clear to the West going back decades that, hey, this is a big red line for us. Ukraine, it's not just about the Russian minorities, but it's a real threat to us, to our existence. If we are invaded, the traditional invasion route is through Ukraine. Yeah, we've seen it happen before, and we're not going to let it happen again. They haven't made that, they haven't rung the alarm bells about the Baltic states in the same way. They of course have expressed disapproval of the treatment of the Russian minorities there, but they haven't. They regard it as a very different kind of. It's not something that something they're very unhappy about, but it doesn't. The Baltic states don't present an existential threat in the way that Ukraine did. So I don't think it's going to happen. But I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure there are nationalists within Russia that do push the argument that, you just presented. They say that, we can't let our brothers suffer in these countries. We can't let them be treated as second-class citizens. You can see how that argument can be made. And I'm sure it is made. And you can see how that people could respond to that to that argument. And it may gain traction at some point. I mean, there is that danger. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that how is this conflict going to end? Ukraine will lose, is losing, is essentially lost, I feel like, and that's why they're trying to push some type of peace plan so there isn't a full-on Saigon moment or Kabul moment. But the fact is that we still have this this whole war was started because of the ideology of the West, and that's still there. This NATO expansion, this break apart Russia, destroy Russia ideology. It's not there. So even if you do finish it, I just feel like they're talking about war in 2029. Okay, well, the war Ukraine was just the first part of it and didn't go quite well, but we learned a lot. And now we get to sort of rebuild our forces, and then maybe we can kickstart it through the Baltic states or somewhere else. Or, I just don't know. I just don't feel like.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, I'm afraid that even I think in the end, Russia will win convincingly, but these people will be in denial, the elite, and they will not accept what's going to happen. And they're going to be thinking about ways to getting back at Russia. They'll work to build up their own militaries. They'll work to build up what remains of the Ukrainian military. And there are these flashpoints, places like Transnistria. You just mentioned Transnistria. That's something, again, these are, Russian speakers that want to be part of Russia, but they're part of Moldova. And that could become a flashpoint, especially, if the Russians go to Odessa. It could be a point where the war could begin again. There's always, the West hasn't given up on Belarus. They would like to carry out a color revolution there. It seems like Belashenko has a place under, did I just use, no, that's not.
Lukashenko?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Lukashenko. Yeah, I knew I just said that wrong. Lukashenko.
Belarus and Lukashenko.
Yeah, I even combined the two of them. Right. He should be called Belashenko. No, he's Lukashenko. Right. Anyway, he seems to be in firm control of things there. He is. I think it's clear he's actually a very popular leader, and has been for a long time. Even when there hasn't been the forms of democracy there. It's just that it's been a country at peace, and that is, compared to so many other Eastern European countries, it's prospered. And the people there are basically Russians. They do have their own, Belarusian is not exactly Russian, but they're brother peoples. They're very, very close. And there doesn't seem to be any significant resistance to the close ties with Russia. But there is an opposition there that that the West has supported. They've attempted color revolutions in the past. It was the most recent attempt that made Lukashenko realize, that he couldn't kind of straddle the fence and he had to go over on the Russian side. But again, the West hasn't given up on it. They still have their female Juan Guaido, or I should say, who is the new Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Maria Machado or something like that.
Yeah, right. Well, they have the equivalent. There's a woman who they say should be the real winner or the ruler of Belarus, and she continues to criticize Lukashenko from the sidelines, and there are always plans being laid to try to create trouble there. So anyway, I'm just saying that the West is not going to give up, and there are potential flashpoints. And so, even if the Russians win convincingly, I don't think there's any sign that the Europeans are going to say, okay, just accept the new reality, and adjust their thinking accordingly. They just have shown they have given no indication that they're going to do this.
Okay, so basically then what you're saying is that the deep state blob, the establishment, whatever it is, it can't change. So that means it has to die. It has to be defeated and fall apart, right? That's the only thing. We're not going to have it change that. So there will be sort of, maybe not directly a hot war, but essentially like a new Cold War, a new kind of Iron Curtain, and potential little flashpoints and proxies being fought between these two, right? Until there is just a collapse within the establishment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's probably what it's going to take. It looks like to me that
how can the establishment collapse?
I don't know. I don't know, but it can. The Soviet Union collapsed. The collective West could collapse too. I mean, they have put themselves on an unsustainable trajectory. It's just that they refuse to give up the supremacist thinking, but that worked 20 years ago because they really were the unrivaled, hyperpower, the U.S. plus Western Europe. But it's over. It's just the distribution of power is changing. China is rising, Russia is rising, and much of the global South is rising too. And so they just, you look at the statistics, the population, whether it's population or share of global economy. They once had a very large share of the pie, but now it's, that their slice of the pie is getting smaller, with every year. And so this kind of thinking, is now increasingly detached from the reality. So, that's one thing. And then they're just also on, I think, clearly an unsustainable economic trajectory. It's, all of these countries are severely indebted, including the U.S. And at some point, they have, I think they've just kind of developed a smugness, a sense of invincibility over the years. It's just like, okay, there used to be warnings about the debt, but then we incurred lots of debt. Nothing happened, so let's stop worrying about it. But at some point, it's going to come back and haunt them in a big way. So, whatever it is, if it's military or I think it's like we see, it's a combination of all those things. We talked about the three pillars. They're losing their soft power, as they as they grow weaker, relatively weaker, it becomes, it used to be that just, other countries recognized their power and would willingly, line up with them. They say, these are the winners. We're going to do it their way. But over time, the other countries become more and more reluctant to do that. They see that, hey, I'm not going to sacrifice my relations with China or Russia for you, because, my economic relationship, my political relationship with these countries are very important. They're also very important countries. Well, how does the West react to that? They don't say, okay, yeah, the new multipolar world, you're free to do what you want. No, they try to coerce those other countries. In the past, they didn't need to. But then when they take the coercive track, that anchors people, and that actually that hurts their soft power, and and they become less appealing countries to say, maybe in the short run, Trump can win with his bullying tactics. But in the long run, it just makes the West, less appealing. So many countries and people, throughout the world look to the West as the way things ought to be done. They hope that would be their future. But over time, clearly it's just not nearly as true as it once used to be. There's some residual affection for the West, especially in places like Eastern Europe. It exists in other parts of the world too, but that's weakening with every passing day. So anyway, soft power is weakening. The economic power is weakening, and military too. At some point, I don't know when it is, but it just can't. The edifice can no longer stand. Those pillars get weaker and weaker. And at some point, there is going to be some kind of collapse. Maybe again we're seeing the beginnings of it in different ways. So it may just be a slow motion collapse over time. Kind of like, again, I think it was Garland Nixon. He uses the analogy of the Titanic and how each section fills up, and then I think that's good. That's sort of what's happened. Like we hit the iceberg already. The first section's filled up. Now the second section's filling up, and the Titanic is going to be more obvious that it's sinking with every passing year.